is the second in our CMO Thrive series, and our topic today is proving contribution to revenue. My name is Laura, and I'll be your moderator today. First, a few quick housekeeping items. If you have questions or technical issues during today's session, please let us know in the question pane in your control panel. We'll have a time for Q&A after the presentation. Also, a recorded version of this webinar will be available after the event concludes. Our focus today will be on 4 metrics that impact pipeline and revenue, and ultimately the return on investment. I'd like to take a quick moment and introduce today's speakers. Andrew Hull is president and founder of Elixiter, a team of 45-plus Marketo experts focused on best practice implementation and execution in the Marketo platform. Andrew is a veteran of the software as a service space. He served in a wide range of positions at Right Now Technologies, which was acquired by Oracle, overseeing product messaging, web properties, marketing automation, events, and marketing analytics before starting Elixiter. Also with us today is Kate Goosens. Kate leads the business intelligence team here at Elixiter. She has experience in sales operations and FP&A analyst roles, most recently with Aptus. With a decade plus of experience, Kate understands the sales process through every stage, and more importantly, knows how to report and advise based on the numbers. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew to begin today's session. Andrew, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone for joining the second part of our 3-part series. We saw quite a few registrants from our first webinar that are attending today and have dialed in, so welcome. And for those of you that may have missed our first one, I'll give you just a quick recap to set the stage for Kate before I hand it over to her. And I think it's appropriate that we start with the slide that we ended on last webinar, which is the metrics that you should really be thinking about as a marketing manager, director, and CMO. We've had the fortunate opportunity to work with many CMOs, VPs, and directors over the last 6 years at Elixiter, and the one thing we've really noticed is that the questions that are being asked or that are required to be answered are different than they were 6 and 7 years ago. For those of you that have been in this space for a while, you remember that a lot of the metrics that we as marketers had to answer 6, 7, 8, 9 years ago was, what was the number of leads in your flow, maybe click rates, open rates, even MQLs up until I think a couple years ago were perfectly acceptable metrics for marketing to know what was going to sales with those numbers. And those are still, by the way, important to know, but I think they fall more into a marketing operations category that as marketing operations professionals, we need to know those because they're leading indicators of other things happening in your pipeline and your revenue funnel. But quite honestly, the bar is getting raised and has been raised for all of us as marketing professionals. And that's really what this series is about, is making sure that you're focusing on those metrics. And as you're looking at the slide we have in front of you, it's really around the pipeline. What are you influencing pipeline? The revenue that you're influencing across your sales cycle. What are the top lead sources, the things that are driving first touch, that are working in your demand creation process? And then also what's touching those deals along their way to close. And the ultimate goal of all of this is that as a CMO and director, and when you have to report to the board and other constituents within your company, is that you can just have a much more informed and intelligent conversation with them about what's going on inside your company. So whatever your benchmarks are inside your company, you at least know where you're at, and you know if you're increasing your influence on pipeline or increasing your influence on revenue, or exactly which programs you're going to reinvest in, because you actually know that it's influencing your acquisition, or you know that it's influencing your middle of funnel. And that's really the point of all this, is that you actually can really increase the conversation you're having with your sales counterparts and your operations and your CFO, and it makes it easier for you to get the dollars or redirect the dollars to the right programs. So we always want to just start with that in mind before we dive into the details. And on the previous webinar, we also just talked about making sure that you are doing this in the right context. So while I don't have a slide up here for you, I just remind everyone that as marketers, we still have to know what goals have been outlined for the year. You know, are those goals aligned to your business? We certainly need to know that. And how is your team going along that trajectory for those goals? So just keep in mind, we're going to be going, as promised, quite a bit deeper under the cover, so to speak, on all these metrics. And that's to ensure that you and the rest of your team have actionable takeaways from this, and that in the context of the Marketo and, for most of you, Salesforce combination that you're running from the platform side, you can have some really actionable items you can go and check and see if you're executing on those. So Kate's going to dive in here really quick, and she also discussed a couple common roadblocks, by the way. Some of those we're all painfully aware of, right? There's no marketing or sales process or alignment. Still need to go do that. Unfortunately, we can't wave a magic wand and make Marketo go do that if you haven't sat down with your internal teams to define that. Lacking a program structure in Marketo is going to cause you a lot of roadblocks. Data cleanup, still need to think about that, because any process you do to improve that is ultimately going to help your metrics and your analytics, of course. And then some other areas that Kate's going to talk about, like tactical items like marking successes in your programs in Salesforce. So while some of these are high level, some of them really do get down to very tactical things you want to make sure that you're doing inside your systems. And then, you know, getting around some of these roadblocks requires that, one, you've identified them. That's what we tried to do in our webinar last time for you, was making sure you knew what you needed to identify, communicating what you're planning on doing, implementing those changes, which this webinar and the next one are going to give you quite a bit of fodder for what elements you need to check, and then also what do you need to go implement or change, and then lastly, the holy grail, which is to be able to report, analyze, and get the insight out of it. So that brings everybody up to speed. I hope it provides you a level set before I hand it over to Kate, and she's going to jump in here. So Kate, go ahead and take this away.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So let's get started and let's dive into some of these metrics and really get into some of the specifics, because I think that's going to be key during this webinar. So these 4 metrics listed here, and if you joined the first webinar, you recognize a lot of these metrics. These are the 4 main metrics we're going to cover today, so we're going to discuss in detail how you can start leveraging them. I think as we walk through these 4, the key takeaway is, if you're, let's say, reporting on them today, or that's the goal that you have to get to a point where you're actually reporting on all 4 of these areas, there's hopefully things today that will be key takeaways that maybe you aren't doing today in your day-to-day process, and things that can help you get to these numbers. And if you're just now starting to build these reports and analyze the data, hopefully it'll be something that can really help you when you're starting to look at the numbers to understand what that data means. So we're going to jump into the first one, which is the pipeline influenced by marketing. Then we'll cover revenue influenced by marketing after that. And as Andrew noted, we want to analyze those top channels and programs that have contributed to pipeline and revenue. And we really want to understand what those activities and those efforts that your team are doing, how are they contributing to that pipeline and revenue won. And then lastly, we'll talk about the percent of total revenue won influenced by marketing. This is really big picture. It's looking at what's that total percent that marketing has had an impact on, and then how can we increase that over time. So with that, let's start talking with pipeline influenced by marketing. So pipeline influenced by marketing, it has really 2 main impacts. You have a first touch impact and a multi-touch impact. So we're going to discuss both in detail. The big takeaway between the 2 is that first touch is really focused on those sourcing channels. It's looking at those records that you're acquiring, and it's then looking to see if they go on to an opportunity down the road. And so in the first touch impact, all of that pipeline credit is going to that first channel, that sourcing channel, and then that acquisition program. During this webinar, we're going to talk a lot about channels, but always know that you can go down to that program level and report on. And that's something we would recommend if you're looking at webinars for the year and understanding what webinar had the most impact. You're going to want to look at the individual program level. For multi-touch, this is really important when you're looking at the full sales cycle or the buying cycle. And you really want to understand out of all of the programs that you have implemented and a record has had a success in those, which actually had the most impact on driving pipeline. And those two answer completely different questions. And we get that question a lot is, should I be focused on first touch impact or should I be focused on multi-touch? And you should be focused on both. But you have to understand what you're hoping to answer. And if you're looking at, hey, of all of our sourcing activities we're doing, what actually has been the most beneficial to bring in records that go on to an opportunity? And then for multi-touches, once we have them in our database and we have those names, what do we do during that buying cycle that's really getting them to an opportunity stage? And so that's really key, is understanding they answer two different things, but they're both important to understand. And so with multi-touch, one thing to remember is that you're going to take that pipeline credit and you're going to split that evenly across all your programs. Where in first touch, like we mentioned earlier, it's really focused on giving credit all to that first program. So that's really important to understand. And so the key takeaway here is just to understand which source, and that's your lead source, is acquiring these new names that go on to generate pipeline, as well as just understanding the marketing activities that you're doing throughout that buying cycle to understand what has had the most impact. And two main things to call out when we're talking about pipeline. We have some examples on the next slide, but the two things to remember is that one, pipeline, when we're looking at what has had the most impact, we're looking at anything that happened before that opportunity was created. So we want to make sure, if we're looking at multi-touch, any engagement prior to the opportunity created. When we talk about revenue, we're actually going to be opening that window up to when they were first acquired to the point that opportunity was closed. So the numbers are going to show you the details of what is actually having the most impact, but just understanding that pipeline and revenue, they may show you different results, and that's okay, as long as you understand what they're answering. So this next slide is giving you two examples of what we just reviewed on first touch and multi-touch when it comes to pipeline. So first touch, this example, it's really showing you that website and trade show have shown the most influence on pipeline from a first touch perspective. And one thing to call out here is that all of these channels, website, sales, trade show, list purchase that you see under that first touch, that is all sourcing channels. And that's really important to understand, because when you're looking at your first touch, you shouldn't be seeing channels that wouldn't have sourced a record. So for example, in that multi-touch on the right, you're going to see that there's a nurture channel there. But we don't see that at the first touch, and that's because you had to have already acquired that record in order to nurture, or for example, the next one is email send, to send them an email. And that's a big difference, and it's important to understand that first touch is only focused on those sourcing channels. Now multi-touch, the pipeline, in this example, you're going to see that webinars had the most influence on pipeline. And so this is a great example that website and webinar, they're showing you two different channels, but they answer two different questions. And it's just important to understand that that webinar that's showing for the multi-touch, that's just saying that throughout that buying cycle, those individuals that went on to an opportunity actually ended up attending that webinar. And multi-touch is specific to having a success in a program. So we need to make sure that you're marking those successes in programs so that we can capture that for multi-touch reporting. So a couple key things. Let's talk about what needs to happen to get this type of reporting in place. So we showed you two examples in that last slide, and there are really 6 key things that you have to have set up and tracking ongoing. It's not a one-time thing. You just want to make sure that you're always tracking correctly in your system. And it also has a big impact on how you want to start seeing the data. And so the key takeaway is that these reports don't just appear by, just creating programs, or it really depends on setting those up correctly. Andrew mentioned some roadblocks that we had from last webinar that we went through, and it's really key that you're setting up the programs correctly. And so these 6 things here kind of go through what those things should be done today in order to start reporting on pipeline influenced by marketing. So let's go through them. The first 2, align lead source to channels and align acquisition program to program names. So these are specific to the first touch metrics we were talking about. When you're looking at the data, all of that opportunity credit is going to go back to those lead sources and acquisition programs wherever that record was acquired. And that's what First Touch is really focused on. So making sure that those are set up is really, really important if you really want to start analyzing what sourcing channel has had the most impact. And then the next one is attaching contacts to opportunities. We talked a little bit about this in the last webinar, but really this is the link to what we can see from the opportunity and the individual that was attached, that contact. We want to know what they were engaged with throughout that buying cycle. They want to know what happened prior to that opportunity being created. And then the next one is implementing an advanced reporting tool. So this is really important if you don't have a reporting tool today and you want to start analyzing and doing attribution reporting and measuring marketing's impact on pipeline and revenue. It's important to have a tool and leveraging that tool. And the key thing there is, even though you have that tool, it's just as important to make sure, if not more important, to make sure that your Marketo is set up properly so that you can actually report on those data points and it's accurate, and that's really key. The last 2 are really specific to multi-touch. So define successes with channels and then make sure to mark those successes in programs. So that's really key when you want to start analyzing all the different things that are happening throughout that buying cycle to understand which programs have had the most impact on pipeline. So with that, let's talk about revenue. So revenue influenced by marketing. So in this, we have the same 2 types of impact, the first touch impact and the multi-touch impact. So these 2 approaches are similar to what we just talked about with pipeline, except we're now focused on that revenue, that opportunity that gets closed, and that new customer that you close. That is important. And so pipeline is something important that we just talked about on how we want to measure what opportunities are being created, but then from that we want to analyze what's actually been closing. And so for First Touch, we're really looking at the sourcing channels that you're acquiring those records that then go on to become customers. And then multi-touch, again, that's just giving credit to all of those programs that a record had a success in, and we want to measure that to understand what was the most impact to influence that revenue. And so a couple things there. We talked about with pipeline, we were really focused on all of the programs that a record had a success in prior to the opportunity to be created. And so with revenue, we're actually looking at from the time that record was acquired to the point when that opportunity was closed once. That full view is really saying what has had the most impact during that entire buying cycle. So in this revenue influenced by marketing slide here, there's a couple key takeaways. And as you start tracking and measuring what has had the most impact on revenue, you can focus on what's working and bringing in those new customers. And that's really important, is if you know what's working, where you can focus your efforts on next year, that's going to help you determine where you need to stay focused, resources that you might need, and then that's going to really help with planning for next year. And again, just remember that what's impacting pipeline may be different than what's impacting revenue, and that's okay. We get a lot of questions that, you know, what we're seeing that's impacting and influencing revenue is different than pipeline. And a lot of times you just have to step back and realize that what's impacting pipeline is anything prior to that opportunity being created. And revenue is looking at the full buying cycle to understand what's had that most impact. And so just understanding the differences there when you're looking at the data is going to help you make better decisions. So as in the pipeline slides, we also have revenue slides with some examples. So here's 2 examples. Again, on a first touch and a multi-touch. In this first touch, you're going to see that website and then sales are the 2 sources that acquired records that went on to an opportunity that went on to a closed won status. And so for the multi-touch, we're looking at webinar and nurture, and those are the two channels that had the most impact throughout that buying cycle that helped influence that revenue. And so when you start to look at these numbers compared to the pipeline influenced by marketing, you're really going to see the differences, and you may not see differences. Either way, it's fine. It's just understanding why there might be a difference and then aligning your goals and your programs to those specific metrics so that you can start planning for next year. So with that, let's go into the key things that you have to have set up in order to really report on revenue influenced by marketing. So a lot of these you'll notice are going to be very similar to what we talked about for pipeline, because they all kind of play together in the sense that you have to make sure that, for example, you're defining your successes and marking those in programs. So the first two is really defining your channels and defining the successes within those channels. And then again, you really need to structure programs appropriately for reporting. A lot of times we get questions on, hey, do I have to have all of this set up today in order to report? And you can report on today if you'd like on these. And sometimes what we find is you're going to find areas that you may want to improve, or that's going to actually show you some areas that you may need to do some cleanup. And that can be as helpful. And so you can start reporting on that, but you may have to go back and clean up and do some additional work, which is okay. Again, attaching contacts to opportunities is really key. And again, that's just going to let us know who had the most impact on that opportunity, and then what did marketing contribute in helping that individual get to the point of a closed won deal. And then implementing an advanced reporting tool. Again, just really important to have a tool set up so that you can start reporting. So defining successes with channels and marking successes in programs. Again, this is really key for multi-touch reporting. Without that, you're not able to see where people engage, and that's really key. So there may be a lot of ways that you want to look at the data and understand what you want to measure. And so stepping back and understanding, hey, what do we want to start tracking? What are our goals this year that we really want to start measuring? These are the things to start thinking about, and then setting up your reports and configuring them so that you can start measuring that data so that you can answer some of those questions. So the third metric that we wanted to cover is really the top channels and programs contributing to pipeline and revenue. We talked a lot about the pipeline that's influenced revenue, or the revenue that's been most impacted by marketing's activities, and so forth. So what we need to now do is step into what are those top channels and programs. So we want to understand what they're doing and what we should be focused on for next year. And so at the end of the day, you really want to understand what are those key drivers. And so that marketing activities that you may or may not be wanting to do for next year, you can make that decision. It really takes the guessing out, and you can start to understand what you want to start planning for next year. So here are 6 things that we really, what you should be focused on or thinking about today. For example, what's driving pipeline may not be driving revenue, and that's okay. And we talked about that. It's a different metric, and it's just important to understand the differences between the two. You want to drive strategy with every marketing initiative. If you know the data and you know the results that you're starting to measure, you can start making more strategic decisions on what you're going to focus on and plan for next year. You want to align those programs that generate pipeline and revenue. So as you start tracking the data, you want to start taking that and then aligning that to what's actually helping generate pipeline and revenue. So communicate the programs that are impacting revenue. This goes along with the next one, which is work with sales and align to overall goal. Communicating what's working and maybe not working is key, so that you can make sure that you're aligning what you're doing to the overall goal. That's really important at the end of the day, to make sure that you all are aligned in the same overall business goal. And then the last one is adjust or eliminate programs that show little impact on pipeline and revenue. So we talked a lot about what we want to see, what marketing has contributed, but sometimes it's important to say, okay, this may not be working, so changing it and not guessing whether or not it is or not each year, doing the same thing year over year, but maybe just saying, hey, we should adjust this or eliminate something that we're doing today that's just not really contributing to pipeline and revenue. But now having the results to make those decisions, that's really what's key. The last metric is looking at the percent of total revenue won influenced by marketing. So we talked a lot about pipeline and revenue influenced by marketing, but we also want to step back and look at the overall picture. We want to know what's the percent of total revenue won that was influenced by marketing. There's a couple things here. So one of the questions on this slide is what percent of revenue is marketing not influencing? So knowing what's working is really important, but also not looking to see why that percent of revenue was not influenced by marketing is just as important. You want to know maybe where you can improve, and that's really where you can start taking the data and measuring. The last two questions, how is marketing impacting customer base and which marketing efforts had the most impact on closing new business? We talked a lot about those, but one of the more important key takeaways here is not just focusing on new business, but also your current customer base and understanding where expansions, upsells, renewals, how is marketing affecting that? And starting to compare that to what you are doing on the new business opportunities and understanding there is a difference, but then aligning to that. And that's really key here. So we talked about the 4 key metrics. We now want to talk about optimizing marketing's impact. So we talked a lot about these, but these are 5 key takeaways just at the end of this webinar that you can take away from today is, 1, start tracking in Marketo. If you're not doing this today, or maybe it's not in your day-to-day process, it's really just defining your channels, making sure you're marking those successes within programs, tracking lead sources and acquisition programs. It's really important, especially when we talked about the first touch. You also want to identify your reporting tool. If you're not reporting today or you want to start reporting, you need to make sure that you're building those reports and measuring those results, as well as making sure that you have the right tool in place and making sure that it's the right tool for you. Start with a baseline. You need to start somewhere. So you need to develop the even to sales if you want to work together with them to tell them, hey, these are the things that are really helping influence those deals that are closing. That's really important to communicate. And then again, you always want to identify concerns or roadblocks. We talked about this in the last webinar, but it is really important to see where there might be a roadblock and then have a solution to fix it. So let's talk about next steps. So is marketing contributing? That's a really important question, but it's also how are they contributing and where is marketing contributing? We talked a lot about where we can see top channels and programs and how they're contributing to pipeline and revenue, but it's really important to understand how and where marketing is contributing and communicate that. You want to take those results and make business decisions. So the last thing we kind of want to leave you with is a few questions on what you should be thinking about. And so at the end of the day, how do you know what's working or not working? And so that's really key here is if you know what's working, then you can start planning for next year, making sure you have the right efforts in place. And so here are a couple things to start thinking about. And if you already are thinking about that, that's great. Are you tracking which programs are helping build pipeline? And then which programs are driving new business? And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but also not only just new business, but looking at what's having an impact on expansions, upsells, etc. And then how are you budgeting for next year? If you're not reporting today, are you continuing to, or if you are reporting today, are you using those results when you're starting to plan for next year? And then where are you focusing your efforts? I think that's a really important point is with the data, you really want to focus on what's working. So this last slide is just, again, showing you the metrics that Andrew covered at the beginning of this webinar. And we bring this back up again just to really to encourage you and your team to start measuring marketing's contribution and efforts and really start looking at the numbers so that you guys can make better decisions and help plan for the next year. And start communicating and making sure that the goals are aligning to the efforts that you have. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we'll go from there.
Excellent. Thank you, Kate. We've had some good questions come in. Let's start with this one. This is for you, Kate. If I don't have an advanced reporting tool, can I do any attribution reporting?
So unfortunately, without an advanced reporting tool, you are limited in what you can report on when it comes to attribution, especially if you want to do advanced attribution reporting to really measure marketing's impact on revenue. And so we definitely would recommend considering a reporting tool. And again, there's a lot of really great reporting tools out there, so just make the right decisions for your business.
Great, thank you. Another question. What kind of reports do you use in Marketo to show multi-touch attribution?
So if you have the Marketo Advanced Reporting Tool, RCE, or if you're focused on that tool right now that you're asking about, you can use a couple reports inside of that tool. And essentially, just remember that if you're using that tool, you're going to have to build the report out, but you're going to want to make sure that you're setting up your programs, your marketing successes inside of Marketo. And so with that, if you are wanting to do multi-touch reporting, you're going to want to use Marketo's Advanced Reporting Tool, which is RCE.
Excellent, thank you. Okay. I know you discussed both first touch and multi-touch. Is there one that you would recommend focusing on?
So we get this question a lot because when you're looking at first touch and multi-touch and then you're also focusing on pipeline and revenue, we get the question of where should we be focusing? And so I think it's important to understand what you're trying to answer. So for example, in the first touch, we talked about this a little bit, but that's really looking at those sourcing channels and understanding where you're sourcing, new records, and then if they go on to become an opportunity, to become a customer. And so that's really focused on those sourcing records that, the most important lead source that's bringing those records in, whereas multi-touch is really analyzing all of those marketing efforts throughout that buying cycle. So that's going to tell you what has had the most impact on pipeline and revenue by looking at all of the efforts across that whole entire buying cycle. So they answer two different questions, so it's just making sure you understand what you're trying to answer and then leveraging those to report on.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, here's another one. What if the sales team is not attaching contacts to opportunities and creating opportunities out of the current sales process?
Yep, so that is critical to make sure the sales team is following that proper process. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but it's really the link between that opportunity and the activities that happened prior to the opportunity being created. And then once that opportunity gets closed won, it's really understanding that individual that's being attached to the opportunity, what they had engaged in throughout that buying cycle. And so sometimes it's just communicating why that's important and also communicating that with that data that you can actually help them because you're going to understand what's having the most impact on influencing closed deals. And so leveraging that data is really helping them.
And I would also just chime in here that don't leave the webinar in a state of despair if for some reason your sales team is not attaching contacts to date, because the good news is you can retroactively go do that. And in a lot of our clients' cases, that function is getting handled by sales ops or marketing operations, because no matter how well you design the system or process, there are situations where opportunities will ultimately make it all the way to close and there's not a contact associated to it. And the good news is you can go back, attach the contact, and all that marketing activity information is living at the contact record, and then the database is able to make that inference through. So these are examples where you retroactively improve your reporting and analytics, and that data is not lost, it just needs to get associated correctly. So there's a lot of situations with our clients where they may believe that they're missing a whole bunch of data, and that's simply not the case. It's just going back and making those adjustments in the system. And Kate's made some great references to making sure that your channels are set up. And just for those that maybe aren't as familiar with Marketo and Salesforce, the examples of channels, like a channel would be an event, is an example of a channel. And then when Kate's referencing programs, that's an example of the event that you do in Las Vegas in May of Q2. That's the next level down. So just to make sure for those that aren't as familiar with Marketo, we were referencing those terms quite frequently throughout this. Just wanted to give you a really concrete example of what do we mean by a channel, and making sure that your channels are defined and set up. And then what is it when we talk about a marketing program, what is that? So again, just a little bit more color, I think, to some of the terms we've been using throughout the webinar.
Great. Here's one sort of related to that as well. If our marketing team has not been marking successes, will we be able to report on how marketing has impacted pipeline and revenue?
So that's a great question, and two parts there. So with first touch reporting, it's important to make sure that your lead sources and acquisition programs are correctly set up so that you have that data so you can actually leverage some of the reporting with a first touch perspective, because it's only looking at what's the lead source and acquisition program. However, for multi-touch, successes are really important because that's actually how you're measuring what marketing's impact is on revenue. So without having those successes being marked in those programs, you're really not going to be ever able to do any sort of multi-touch reporting. And so that's really important to start creating in your everyday process when you're creating programs. It's really for multi-touch.
And following on that with Kate, successes, when we talk about success, utilizing kind of a webinar or an event channel example, and if you think about your attendance today on this webinar, success in that example could mean different things for different clients, but the important thing is to just define it. So an example here is success for some clients would be that you registered for the webinar, and if you attended or watched the on-demand version, the recorded version of those webinars, all three of those are considered successes. So in Kate's example, this would get attributed to somebody moving through the pipeline as a multi-touch. But for some clients, the bar might be a lot higher, where only attending the webinar or watching, downloading the recorded version of the webinar is considered a success. So that's an example where for every channel type, whether it's a webinar, event channel type, website, you need to go and actually pull up Marketo and Salesforce. Ideally, you've gone through and made sure that those success levels have been rationalized between the two. And if we use this webinar example, you've actually pulled it up and said, do we consider a registrant a success or not? Yes or no. Do we consider attending? Yes or no. Do we consider downloading the webinar? Yes or no. So that's what we mean by actually going channel by channel and determining what is success. Just like in a website channel, for most clients, downloading the white paper, for example, is considered a success. Just simply viewing something that's non-gated would never be considered a success, at least as far as tracking goes. Obviously, we want people consuming information off the website, but for a lot of clients, you actually have to fill out a form, or we have to be able to attribute exactly what you did in order to check that box and say that that's a success for that channel.
So in taking a step back from that, we have a good question. Where in Marketo do you go to change or see the success definition for each channel?
Yeah, so that is done in Marketo under the administrative area of Marketo, and then under the admin section there is a section called channels and tags. I won't go into so much what tags are, but that does help with Revenue Cycle Explorer, the advanced tool that Kate was talking about. But that's actually where you do it, and you can pull up. Marketo kindly supplies a range of channels that they think are common, especially for business-to-business marketing. But like with every client, that's a starting point, and you may want to use terms that are just a little different than what Marketo supplied. And sometimes that's naming and statuses that come from Salesforce, because in a lot of clients' cases, the Salesforce system may have gone in first, and you're happy with those names, and you're happy with the names of those channels, so you can just simply tweak it and make a slight change to it. So the example there would be, you might call a certain channel in Salesforce live events, and Marketo just calls it events. So you can just simply rename it. But in some cases, you might actually have a channel that is very defined in your world, in your industry, and it just simply doesn't exist in Marketo or Salesforce. And that's where you need to create it and actually define what the steps are. The steps to success are, you've invited them, they've registered, steps they've attended. Those would be the most basic 3 steps, but the invite lets us know who we invited, but that's not considered a success because you haven't actually registered for it yet. So hopefully that just really basic example helps you understand how those more tactical decisions actually feed your reporting. And the good news is, in most cases, you can retroactively update this information if you know who attended or didn't, or had you sent out an email for a webinar. So an example would be, you used a third-party webinar tool and you mistakenly just set it up as an email type program, so it's an email channel, but you later realize that it really was a webinar that you were promoting. You can create that program in Marketo. You can retroactively assign people who were invited, and you can retroactively assign who it was a success for and who attended. So there are plenty of opportunities to be able to adjust or recreate the data if you're not perfectly aligned today. And I think that's one that gives most clients a rosy outlook that says, hey, not only can you do this going forward, which helps as you go through the sales cycle, but there's plenty of opportunities to go and retroactively fix things that, to Kate's point, can give you immediate insight into what's working and not. You just may not have had the reporting set up to give you that visibility quite yet.
Perfect. Great. Definitely wonderful and comforting to know that if you haven't been doing it to this point, there's a lot of ways that you can go back and retroactively capture those successes in that data. And I think with that, that'll be the last question we take. Before we sign off, I did want to invite you to join us for part 3. This will be the final session of this series. And we're going to be diving deep into these final 4 metrics. So very similar format to today, but we'll be covering the metrics you see on your screen there. There is a URL there on your screen you can access to register if you're not already, but we'll also send that to you in a follow-up email later today with the recording. And with that, I just really want to thank you all for joining us. If you have any questions not answered today, we would love to hear from you. Andrew's contact info will pop up here on the screen in just a moment. And from everyone here at Elixiter, we just want to thank you for your time today and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.